the Union soldiers on the other side until more Union soldiers showed up behind them. And the slaughter over here was just terrible. Crew came here not long after, and if you look behind you here, you can see one of the famous photos they took.
What if a single photograph could rewrite everything we think we know about American history? For more than 100 years, historians believed certain moments were never captured on camera. No photos, no proof, just sketches, letters, and assumptions passed down as fact. But one image, hidden in an attic, sealed away in wax paper, changed all of that. At first glance, it looks like a normal Civil War photo. Abraham Lincoln, Union generals, sabers at their sides. But then you notice the details that shouldn't be there. The colors are too vivid, the clarity is impossible, and standing between Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant is a man no history book has ever named. He doesn't appear in military records, he doesn't appear in archives, and according to official documents, he shouldn't even be alive when this photo was taken. So who was he? Why was he placed at the center of one of the most important moments in American history? And why was this photograph never meant to be seen? Because once experts zoomed in, they realized this wasn't just a picture. It was a warning, a message, and proof that something was deliberately erased. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's a trail of evidence hidden for over a century, waiting for the right moment to resurface. This is the photo that should never have existed.
Like the absolute nerd that I am, and I came across a very interesting article about a photograph that was taken during the Civil War.
It didn't begin with a historian, a museum, or a locked government archive. It began in an attic. Claire Donovan wasn't searching for secrets that afternoon. She was doing what most people eventually do, cleaning out a family home that had collected generations of forgotten things. Old coats, broken lamps, boxes no one had opened in decades. The kind of place where dust settles so thick it feels permanent. That's when she found the trunk. It was wedged behind a stack of collapsed boxes, barely visible beneath insulation and cobwebs. The leather straps were cracked. The brass latch was green with age. It looked like something that hadn't been touched since before electricity was common in the house. Inside were the usual remnants of the past. Faded letters tied with string, railroad bonds, lace gloves yellowed by time. Nothing unusual, nothing valuable, until her hand brushed against something heavy. At the bottom of the trunk sat a leather-bound photo album. The spine was split, the corners curled inward like dry leaves. It felt fragile in her hands, as if opening it too quickly might cause it to fall apart. Most of the photographs inside were exactly what you'd expect. Black and white portraits, stiff faces, blank expressions, soldiers, families, moments frozen without emotion. But near the back of the album, one image was different. It wasn't loose like the others. It was sealed, wrapped carefully in wax paper, its edges pressed tight, as if someone had gone out of their way to preserve it. Even stranger, the paper carried a faint scent. Not mold, not dust, something sharper, something deliberate. Claire didn't open it right away. She closed the album, set it aside, and finished cleaning. But the thought of that sealed photograph stayed with her. By nightfall, curiosity won. When she finally peeled back the wax paper, she stopped breathing, because staring back at her was Abraham Lincoln, and nothing about the image made sense. But what truly disturbed her wasn't Lincoln at all. It was what stood beside him, and that's when everything began to unravel. At first glance, Claire thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The photograph showed Abraham Lincoln standing slightly to the right of the frame, tall and unmistakable in a black frock coat. His top hat cast a thin shadow across his face. Around him stood several Union officers, their posture rigid, sabers hanging at their sides. General Ulysses S. Grant was there. General George Meade, too. Men whose faces had been studied and restudied for generations. But this image wasn't familiar. Between Lincoln and Grant stood an empty wooden chair, positioned as if someone had just stepped away, and clustered around it, the man appeared mid-conversation, not posed, not stiff, but caught in motion. That alone was strange. Then Claire noticed the color, not the soft tinting sometimes brushed onto old photographs, not painted cheeks or artificial blue coats. This was real color. Deep Union blues, dusty browns on worn boots, the wood grain of the chair visible in warm tones. Even the creases in Lincoln's coat reflected subtle shifts of light. It looked modern, too modern. Civil War photographs were never like this. The technology simply didn't exist. In the 1860s, cameras captured light and shadow, nothing more. Color photography wouldn't arrive for decades. And yet, here it was. Claire tilted the photograph toward the window, half expecting the colors to vanish under under different light. They didn't. They held. Solid. Embedded. Her hands began to shake. If this photo was fake, it was the most sophisticated forgery she'd ever seen. But if it was real, then it shouldn't exist at all. She studied the details more closely. The uniforms were accurate down to the stitching. The sabers matched period issue designs. The background, blurred but recognizable, looked like an outdoor command area, not a studio. Nothing about it felt staged, except for one thing. There were no known photographs of Lincoln at Appomattox. Historians had always agreed on that point. Sketches existed, written accounts too, but no camera had ever captured him there. Until now. Claire felt the weight of what she was holding settle into her chest. This wasn't just a family heirloom. It wasn't just an old picture. It was a contradiction. And contradictions don't stay quiet for long. So she did the only thing that made sense. She showed it to an expert, but the moment he saw it, his reaction told her this was far bigger than she imagined. Professor George Kramer had seen thousands of Civil War photographs in his career. Cabinet cards, tintypes, album and prints so common he could identify them by touch alone. When Claire placed a photograph on his desk, she expected skepticism. She got silence. Kramer didn't speak right away. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and brought the image closer to the light. His fingers hovered above the surface, careful not to touch it. The room felt uncomfortably quiet. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked. Claire explained the attic, the trunk, the wax paper, every detail she could remember. Kramer listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the photo. After a long moment, he straightened up and exhaled slowly. "This paper," he said, tapping the table beside the image, "is albumin silver print stock, 1860s, no question." Claire felt a rush of relief, then confusion. "So it's real?" Kramer shook his head. "That's not what I said." He leaned in again, this time pointing to the surface itself. "Albumin prints cannot hold color like this. They weren't engineered for it. Even hand-tinted photographs sit on top of the image. This," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this color is part of the photograph." Claire swallowed. "So it's a fake?" Kramer's voice dropped. "No, that's the problem." He explained that under magnification, fake color always reveals itself. Brushstrokes, uneven pigment, chemical inconsistencies, but this image showed none of that. The color was uniform, embedded, fused into the emulsion itself, impossible by known standards. Kramer arranged for further analysis at the New York Historical Society, where the photograph could be examined with high-resolution scanners and forensic imaging tools. Claire agreed, still unsure whether she was protecting history or unleashing something that should have stayed buried. When the lab results came back, there was no room left for doubt. The pigments weren't applied after the fact. They were introduced during development. Organic dyes, some plant-based, bonded directly into the photographic layers. The paper fibers dated cleanly to the 1860s, decades before color photography was supposed to exist. The room fell quiet as the implications settled in. This wasn't just a photograph ahead of its time. It was a process no one was ever meant to know about. But as the experts argued over chemistry and timelines, Claire noticed something none of them were focused on. A man standing calmly between Lincoln and Grant. Not a general, not an aide, not anyone she recognized. And somehow, she knew the technology wasn't the real mystery. The real mystery was him. While the experts debated pigments and paper stock, Claire couldn't stop staring at the figure in the middle of the photograph. He stood between Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, yet somehow blended into the background. Not because he was insignificant, but because he didn't announce himself. No medals, no visible rank, no ceremonial saber like the others, just a uniform stripped of identifiers. That alone was unusual. Civil War officers were meticulous about rank. Even medics and aides wore clear markings, but this man's coat was plain, almost intentionally so. His posture was calm, balanced, as if he belonged exactly where he stood. And then Claire felt it. Recognition. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through old family photos she digitized years earlier. Most were unremarkable. Farmers, weddings, posed portraits. Then she stopped. A photograph from 1912. It showed an older man standing outside a barn, one hand resting on a dog's head. He was heavier, dressed like a farmer, his hair graying, but the face was unmistakable. The jawline, the ears, the slight slope of the eyebrows. It was the same man. Claire's breath caught. "That's him," she whispered. Professor Kramer leaned over, comparing the two images side by side. His expression tightened. "That would be impossible," he said slowly. "The man in the Civil War photo would have to be at least 70 by 1912. "I know," Claire replied, "and that photo is of my great-great-grandfather." The room went still. She explained the family stories, how her grandfather used to mention an ancestor named William Donovan who had served in the war and never came home. No body, no grave, just listed as missing. Kramer began typing furiously, pulling up military records. A moment later, he froze. William Donovan, 104th New York infantry medic. Status: missing in action. Last recorded date: April 6, 1865. Claire felt a chill. 3 days before Lee's surrender. Kramer nodded slowly. And 3 days before the date this photograph would have been taken. The implication hung in the air. If William Donovan disappeared on April 6, how could he be standing beside Abraham Lincoln days later? And why was he positioned so deliberately in the center of the frame? It didn't feel accidental. It felt curated, as if someone wanted him there but never wanted anyone to ask why. And that's when Claire remembered something that made her stomach drop. A line from an old family letter she'd seen as a child. It read, "If you ever find the photograph with the chair, burn it. It was never meant to be kept." Suddenly, the photo wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. By the time Claire remembered the warning in her family letter, Professor Kramer was already digging deeper than standard military records. Missing soldiers weren't uncommon near the end of the war, but men didn't simply vanish from one regiment and reappear beside the president without explanation. Late that night, Kramer called her. "I found something," he said, his voice tight, "and it's not supposed to exist." Back at the New York Historical Society, he pulled up a scanned War Department field memo dated April 1865. It was buried among routine logistical notes, easy to overlook unless you knew exactly what to search for. One line stood out: WD transferred to Shadow Post per Al's request, not to be logged, no rank change. Claire stared at the screen. WD? Kramer said quietly. William Donovan. And Al, that's how Lincoln's inner circle referred to him in private correspondence. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a clerical error, it was a deliberate removal. Donovan hadn't gone missing. He'd been reassigned, pulled out of official records, and placed somewhere no historian was meant to look. Kramer explained that near the end of the war, Lincoln's security was increasingly unstable. Threats came from everywhere: political rivals, disgruntled soldiers, extremists who believed the war's outcome was a betrayal. Trust was thin. So he built something off the books, Claire said slowly. A shadow network, Kramer replied. Men with no rank, no paper trail, no public identity. Their job wasn't to fight, it was to observe, escort, and intervene if necessary. As they returned to the photograph with fresh eyes, Elsa, the forensic imaging specialist, noticed something no one had seen before. She zoomed in on Donovan's coat collar. "Hold on," she said. "There's something under the fold." As the image sharpened, a tiny stitched patch came into view, partially hidden beneath the lapel, worn, faded, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. 3 letters: PEC. Kramer's face drained of color. Presidential Escort Committee. Claire frowned. "That's not in any history book." "No," Kramer said, "because it wasn't meant to be." The patch was proof that Donovan wasn't standing there by chance. He wasn't a misplaced medic or a civilian in uniform. He was positioned exactly where Lincoln wanted him, close enough to watch, close enough to act, and invisible enough to disappear afterward. But as disturbing as that revelation was, it wasn't the worst part, because beneath that patch, something else had been stitched, and it would change everything. At first, it looked like nothing more than wear and tear, loose threads, faded stitching, the kind of damage you'd expect on a uniform worn through months of war. But Elsa kept zooming in, isolating the fibers beneath the small PEC patch. "This isn't damage," she said quietly. "It's writing." The room went silent. Using spectral imaging, she adjusted the contrast until the threads separated from the fabric. Slowly, deliberately, a line of text emerged, stitched in thread just 1 shade lighter than the code itself. "Target verified. Stand until April 14. No one spoke. April 14, 1865. The day Abraham Lincoln was shot. Claire felt her legs weaken. She gripped the edge of the table, staring at the words as if they might change if she looked away long enough. "Target verified," she whispered. "That's not protection language." Mason, the conservator, shook his head. "That's operational language. It means someone had identified a threat, and stand until implies a countdown, not a location, a deadline." The implications were terrifying. If the message was real, and everything about the photo suggested it was, then William Donovan knew something. He was aware of a verified danger and was assigned to stand in position until April 14. Whether that meant protecting Lincoln or watching someone else, no one could say. Kramer broke the silence. "This explains why he vanished." Claire turned to him. "You think he was silenced?" "I think," Kramer said carefully, "that anyone who knew what he knew would not be allowed to speak freely afterward." The family warning suddenly made sense. Burn the photograph, because the photo wasn't just proof of Donovan's presence, it was proof of foreknowledge, evidence that someone inside Lincoln's circle knew a threat was coming and that Donovan had been placed near the center of it. And yet, there were no records of him after April 14. No reassignment, no death notice, no discharge, just silence. As chilling as the message was, it raised an even more disturbing question. If Donovan was assigned to stand until April 14, what happened when that day arrived? The answer wasn't in the faces. It was in the photograph photograph itself and in the impossible technology that made it.
President Lincoln was shot and killed by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth at the Ford Theater. His death came less than 1 week after the Civil War ended.
By now, the photograph had stopped behaving like an artifact and started acting like a message. The stitched warning beneath Donovan's lapel changed how everyone in the lab looked at the image. It wasn't just documenting a moment in time, it was preserving information. And that meant the technology behind it mattered more than ever. Elsa returned to the chemical analysis with new urgency. If this was meant to survive, she said, it would have to be built differently. She isolated the color layers again, this time mapping how the pigments bonded to the paper fiber. What she found made no sense under known 19th century chemistry. The image wasn't tinted, it wasn't painted, it wasn't enhanced after development. The color was formed during exposure. Organic pigments, beetroot, indigo, and carbon-based compounds had been mixed into the emulsion itself. They reacted to light, binding just long enough to imprint color before stabilizing permanently. A fragile process, unrepeatable without precise conditions. It's a hybrid, Elsa said. Part photography, part experimental chemistry, and it would have taken months to perfect. Too complex for a battlefield experiment, too intentional to be accidental. Then Kramer uncovered a reference that made the room go quiet. An archived journal belonging to an assistant of Alexander Gardner, one of the Civil War's most prominent photographers. The entry was dated 1866. The president requested one chromatic play for his private record. No reproduction, no public display. Development to be supervised. The implications were immediate. Lincoln had commissioned it, not for propaganda, not for history books, but as a controlled record, something designed to outlast interpretation. Lincoln understood symbolism, Kramer said. He knew how quickly truth gets reshaped. If he wanted something preserved exactly as it happened, he wouldn't trust ink or memory. He would trust light. And if that was true, then the photograph wasn't just a picture. It was a vessel, a container for details meant to be deciphered later by people with the tools to see what others couldn't. Which raised one final question. If this image was meant to be hidden, why did William Donovan keep it? Why warn his family to destroy it? Claire found the answer while examining the album one last time. Tucked behind the lining, folded once and pressed flat by time, was a single sheet of paper. And at the bottom of it, written in familiar, uneven script, was a name that stopped her cold. Al. The envelope was so thin, it almost tore when Claire unfolded it. No seal, no official markings, just a single page, yellowed with age, tucked carefully into the back lining of the album, as if it had been hidden there as a last resort. At the top were two simple words, to William. No last name, no date. Professor Kramer read it slowly, his voice steady but low, as if raising it might break something fragile. My dear William, if this war has taught us anything, it is that truth is often least welcomed by those who claim to guard it. You were chosen not to draw your blade, but to stand where others would not look. There will come a time when peace proves more dangerous than war itself. When that happens, history will decide who is remembered and who is erased. If it gives you a miss, allow it. I will not. At the bottom was the signature, Al. No surname, no title, just two letters. The room was silent. No one needed to say it out loud. The phrasing, the rhythm, the quiet authority in the words. It matched Abraham Lincoln's private correspondence almost exactly. This wasn't an apology, Kramer said finally. It was a directive. Everything clicked into place. William Donovan hadn't been forgotten by accident. He had been removed by design. His role was never meant to be celebrated, recorded, or even acknowledged. He was placed close enough to power to see what others couldn't, and then quietly erased once that role was fulfilled, or cut short. The warning to burn the photograph suddenly made sense. Keeping it meant exposing the existence of something Lincoln had deliberately hidden, a private network, a forewarning, a moment frozen not for history, but for truth. Donovan had followed his orders. He stood where no one expected him. He watched when no one else thought to look, and when history moved on without him, he didn't fight to be remembered, because he was never meant to be. But history has a way of resurfacing what's buried, and sometimes all it takes is a single photograph. By the time news of the photograph reached historians, most struggled to grasp its significance. It wasn't just that the image defied known photography timelines. It wasn't even just that a missing soldier appeared beside Lincoln at Appomattox. It was the story it carried, hidden in plain sight, stitched into fabric, embedded in color, preserved against time. Claire Donovan understood immediately. This wasn't a relic meant for display. It was a promise kept across generations, a silent testament to a man who had done exactly what he was asked, without recognition or reward. She declined every offer. Networks, collectors, institutions, they all wanted it, but the photograph wasn't for sale. sale. Never had been. It had been entrusted to her family for a reason. Lincoln's directive, William Donovan's legacy, and the century-long silence were intertwined. Selling it, publishing it recklessly, would betray that trust. Instead, Claire worked with the New York Historical Society to create an exhibit, not glorifying war, not focusing on Lincoln, but highlighting the man who had stood anyway. The centerpiece, an enlarged replica of the photograph, encased in glass, illuminated gently from behind. Lincoln's tired eyes, the dusty boots, the empty wooden chair, and Donovan in the middle. Alongside it, a biography reconstructed from letters, military records, and forensic analysis. Everything the world had almost forgotten. Above the chair, a printed quote from the letter signed Al. Some men fight with swords, others with silence. Visitors stopped. They read. They stared. Some read the letter twice, tracing the words with their eyes, trying to imagine what it had meant to stand unnoticed, to carry such responsibility without acknowledgement. And Claire didn't need them to see Donovan as a hero. She only needed them to see him, because that was exactly what Lincoln had intended. Not for fame, not for medals, but for the quiet preservation of truth, for vigilance when no one else knew to watch. Through the hidden message, the advanced photography technology, and the letter entrusted to his care, Donovan had carried the burden of history itself. He had stood, as instructed, while the world moved on without him. And now, at last, the world could see. Even after the exhibit opened, Claire couldn't let the mystery rest. There were still questions the photograph and letter hinted at but didn't fully answer. Why had Donovan been chosen for this shadow role? Who else had been part of Lincoln's hidden network? And most unsettling, why did history erase them so completely? Kramer returned to the War Department archives. Late one night, he stumbled upon a set of heavily redacted correspondence, notes that had never been digitized or cataloged. They referred to temporary escorts, men selected outside rank, outside command, responsible for sensitive movement and observation of key personnel. Donovan's name appeared multiple times, always attached to confidential assignments. Nothing about battles, medals, or promotions, just orders to watch, to report, to protect. Claire realized the photograph had been intentionally composed. The empty wooden chair wasn't just a prop, it was a marker, a space held open for potential danger, a visual signal of readiness. Donovan stood beside Lincoln because that was exactly where he was supposed to be, at exactly the moment history assumed he couldn't exist. And then Kramer noticed something else, a minor detail that had gone unnoticed in previous scans. A faint blur behind Lincoln's top hat, almost imperceptible. Could it be a reflection? A shadow? It was difficult to say, but it suggested the photograph wasn't just documenting a single moment. It might have captured a larger context, an entire room, more people, more secrets than anyone had guessed. Claire shivered. Every detail pointed to deliberate preservation, color embedded decades before it should have existed, a man placed where no record should show him, a message stitched into his uniform, a letter hidden for generations. It wasn't just a photograph, it was a puzzle, a carefully designed vessel of truth and warning, meant to survive long enough to be discovered by someone who could understand it. And now that someone was standing in the middle of it all, Claire Donovan. Even after decades of being considered missing, William Donovan's presence in the photograph forced historians to rethink everything they thought they knew about Lincoln's final days. Claire and Kramer continued to uncover small, nearly invisible details in the photograph that hinted at a wider network. Other men like Donovan, who had been deliberately erased from records, assigned to protect, observe, and report without leaving a trace. One detail caught Claire's attention, the faint pattern of shadows on the floor behind Lincoln and Grant. At first glance, it looked like nothing, just the natural play of sunlight. But when Elsa enhanced the spectral scan, the shadows revealed subtle shapes of other figures, standing just beyond the frame, blurred but undeniably present. They were there, Claire whispered. Others, watching, hidden, like Donovan. Kramer nodded, his eyes glued to the screen. Lincoln didn't trust the usual chain of command for sensitive operations at the end. These men weren't in the army hierarchy. They were ghosts in plain sight. Claire realized the truth was more unsettling than anyone had imagined. Donovan wasn't an anomaly. He was a symbol of a broader, secretive effort, a carefully curated network operating under Lincoln's direct authority, invisible to history until now. And yet, the most chilling part remained. Donovan had vanished from every record immediately after April 14th. His orders, his assignment, the very knowledge of the assassination threat, gone. History had been rewritten without anyone realizing it. The photograph had survived, the message stitched into the coat endured, and the letter from Al had been hidden for generations. But the real proof lay in the silence. History had been watching, but history had forgotten. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just a story of a man standing quietly beside Lincoln. It was a story of intentional erasure, of control over memory itself. And for the first time, she understood why her great-great-grandfather had warned her so strongly. The photograph wasn't just a record, it was evidence. Evidence that someone had been tasked to witness history, and that someone's very existence had to be kept hidden. It was a legacy buried in shadow. With each revelation, Claire began to understand the full gravity of what had been entrusted to her family. The photograph, the stitched message, the letter. It wasn't just history, it was responsibility. William Donovan hadn't simply stood beside Lincoln. He had carried a burden that no one else knew existed, and his family had been sworn to secrecy. Professor Kramer leaned back, exhaustion etched into his features. "Think about it," he said quietly. Donovan knew of a threat to the president, stood in the shadow of the most pivotal moment in American history, and then was deliberately erased from all records. That's not just protection, that's control over history itself. Claire traced the faded folds of the letter with her fingers, feeling the weight of Lincoln's words. Stand where they don't expect you. Watch who you need to. And if history gives you a miss, allow it to. I won't. The message wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Donovan had followed it without question, fulfilling a duty that had gone unrecognized for over a century. And yet, the photograph did more than document. Its advanced color technology and intentional composition suggested a level of foresight that went beyond military strategy. Lincoln had engineered a record that would survive, that would reveal the truth to future generations, if the right person found it. Claire realized she had become that person. She held in her hands the proof of a hidden network, the silent witness of history, and the knowledge that one man had stood where no one expected him and no one remembered. It was a burden she hadn't anticipated, but also a responsibility she couldn't ignore. Donovan's story had been silent for too long, and now it demanded to be seen. As she stepped back from the photograph one last time, Claire understood the ultimate lesson Lincoln had left for his quiet guardian. Some battles aren't fought with swords, medals, or speeches. Some battles are fought in silence, in shadow, and then the patience to watch history unfold while remaining unseen. And sometimes the world needs a single photograph to remember what it had forgotten. Even after the exhibit opened and the public finally saw the photograph, Claire couldn't shake the weight of what she had uncovered. Visitors marveled at the vivid colors, the faces of Lincoln and Grant, the empty chair, but few realized the depth of the story hidden in plain sight. Every detail of Donovan's presence had been meticulously crafted. The photograph was not just a moment frozen in time, it was a message stretched across decades. The shadows in the background, the carefully chosen placement, the uniform with its hidden stitched orders, all of it pointed to a man whose purpose went far beyond the battlefield. Claire thought about the implications. Lincoln had created a network that transcended the official records, men who operated in secrecy to safeguard history itself. Donovan had been one of them, a silent observer of pivotal events, tasked with duties that no one would ever acknowledge. And yet, history had almost forgotten him entirely. Generations had passed, stories had faded, and the truth was buried under decades of silence. All that survived was a single photograph, a letter, and the legacy of a man who had done exactly as instructed: stand visible, act discreetly, and allow history to move on without notice. Claire realized something profound. Some of the most important people in history leave no trace. They are not remembered in textbooks or monuments. Their work is invisible, their sacrifices unseen, and yet their impact shapes the course of events in ways the world can barely comprehend. The photograph was not just an artifact, it was a bridge, a connection between the present and the past, between what was visible and what was hidden, between a man who obeyed orders orders in silence, and the society that would only now begin to understand his role. History had almost forgotten Donovan, but through Claire's discovery, through the careful preservation of that photo and letter, the world was finally beginning to see him as Lincoln had intended, a guardian in the shadows, standing where no one expected, yet shaping the course of history. Weeks passed, and the exhibit, The Man Who Stood Anyway, drew visitors from across the country. Scholars debated the photograph's authenticity, journalists wrote features, and students stared at the image, trying to imagine the man who had remained invisible for so long. Claire stood quietly at the back one afternoon, watching a group of schoolchildren linger over the display. She saw the curiosity in their eyes, the same curiosity that had driven her to explore the attic trunk that day. She realized then that Donovan's legacy wasn't just about secrecy, it was about responsibility, about standing where one is needed even when no one notices, even when no one remembers. The letter from Lincoln, tucked carefully behind the photograph, had become the centerpiece of interpretation. Its words, "Some men fight with swords, others with silence," hung above the display, forcing each visitor to confront the idea that heroism doesn't always come with recognition. Claire reflected on her great-great-grandfather's obedience. William Donovan had followed Lincoln's orders without question, protecting the president, witnessing history, and then vanishing without a trace. His life had been erased from public record, yet his actions had helped preserve the very course of history that shaped the nation. In that moment, Claire understood the ultimate lesson. History is not just what is written in books or recorded in photographs. Sometimes it is the silence between the lines, the shadows at the edges of the frame, the quiet guardians whose vigilance makes everything else possible. And for once, Donovan's silence was broken. Through the photograph, the letter, and the painstaking work of modern technology and research, the world could finally see him, not as a soldier, not as a general, but as the man who stood anyway. Claire felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had fulfilled the promise of her family's trust. She had shown the world the hidden truth that had survived the century of obscurity. And in doing so, she ensured that Donovan's legacy, quiet, steadfast, and indispensable, would never be forgotten again. The photograph, once just an artifact in a dusty attic, had become a bridge across time, connecting the present to a history deliberately kept secret. It was proof that some stories are too important to remain hidden, no matter how long the world tries to forget them. And in that revelation, Claire knew one thing for certain. The past may be silent, but its echoes can resonate forever. A single photograph, a century-old secret. A man erased from history, yet standing at the center of one of the most pivotal moments in American history. William Donovan wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't fight with swords, lead armies, or give speeches. He fought with silence, vigilance, and obedience to a mission you could ever understand. That photo wasn't just an image. It was a message across time, embedded in color decades before it should have existed, stitched with hidden instructions and safeguarded with a letter from Abraham Lincoln himself. It revealed the existence of a network that history had tried to erase. A network of shadows, operating quietly, protecting leaders, witnessing events, and leaving no trace behind. Donovan's story reminds us that not all heroes are remembered. Some perform their greatest deeds in the background, unseen, unknown, and unrecognized. And sometimes it takes a single discovery to bring their legacy into the light. So here's the question. If you uncovered proof that the past wasn't what the world believed it to be, would you hide it or would you share it? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more hidden chapters of history, stories of mystery, secrecy, and secrets that were never meant to be found, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next revelation. Because sometimes history isn't just learned, it's uncovered.